Welcome back for another instructional and review video here at College Board. We're going to be talking about topic 5.2 today. 5.2 is the Phillips Curve. I want to welcome you back. I want to give you my thanks for coming along, and I hope that wherever this finds you, wherever you are well. And again, that this brings you back into the classroom and gives you a little more normalcy to your day. So without further ado, let's get started here. My name is Matt Romano again. I'm joining you from Atlanta, Georgia, where I teach AP Macro at Marist School. And we're going to have the same format we had yesterday. We're going to go through a little bit of warm up and review, and then we're going to get into the new content covering the Phillips curve. So what exactly are we going to do? Like I said, it's topic 5.2, the Phillips curve. And when you look at the course and exam description, the learning objective here is first and foremost, simply define the Phillips curve. What is this thing? We have a short run and long run Phillips curve, and we need to know how to define that, identify, and understand what exactly this thing is. What is it trying to represent? Then we need to be able to explain both the short run and long run equilibrium that we see on the ADAS model. We need to be able to explain and identify that on the Phillips curve model. So we're making connections here between models. That's a very important concept and skill in macroeconomics. The skill that we're specifically going to look at is skill 4.B. We're going to practice our ability to demonstrate an understanding of a specific economic situation on an accurately labeled graph or visual. The situation here is going to be the relationship between those two indicators, the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So we're going to be taking a good look at that today and understanding how those two go together. And we're going to start that after we warm up with a little AP exam question. We're going to start that by looking at ADAS and then transfer that knowledge over to the Phillips curve so we can make that clear connection. So to get started, we're going to warm up, and the warm up is going to pick up where we left off yesterday on 5.1. As you'll recall, we finished 5.1 discussing a question from 1999. So we threw it way back, and we had to adapt this question. If you actually look at the question itself, it's written quite differently. The reason for that is the exam itself, the course itself, has certainly evolved over the last 2 decades. And what we did is we took that question and took the nature of it and kept that the same, but tweaked the wording a little bit to give you a little more consistency with what you'll see nowadays. But we had to go that far back to find one that did have that combination of both fiscal and monetary policy without including any topics that we have not covered yet. So that's the reason we did what we did here. Hopefully you took the time to do this question. What I want to do now is start things off by looking at this question and going through the answers to it. So as you read through this, you'll probably see some wording that is slightly different from the more recent questions. Following an increase in consumer confidence, the U.S. economy is experiencing a significant increase in aggregate spending. Using a correctly labeled aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, show how the change in aggregate spending will affect each of the following: output and price level. Then identify one fiscal policy action that could counter the effects identified in Part A. Explain how the policy will affect each of the following: output, employment, and price level. And then finally, in Part C, identify one monetary policy action that could reinforce the effects of the fiscal policy in Part B. Using a correctly labeled money market graph, show how the policy will affect nominal interest rates. So for Part 1, Part A, we want to show on a correctly labeled ADAS model the effects of the increase in spending, aggregate spending. So we know that consumer confidence is going to affect consumption. A more confident consumer is going to spend more money. They feel like they have income coming in. So consumption is going to go up. Aggregate spending goes up. AD is going to shift to the right. That's going to correspond or really cause an increase in output and an increase in price level. So we show that here with the movement from AD to AD1, resulting in a change from output level Y to Y1, output level P to P1. Part B, identify one fiscal policy action that would counter the effects identified in Part A. So we want to counter the effects. That means they're going to go the opposite direction. Perhaps things are moving at a pretty fast pace, and policymakers decide, well, we need to tap on the brakes a little bit here. Let's slow things down. Maybe they're concerned about inflation. Maybe they're concerned about other negative externalities that may be occurring. So we're looking for a contractionary policy, in this case, a contractionary fiscal policy. And that's one piece of attention to detail that you've got to make sure you have in mind. Are we talking fiscal or monetary? Here we're talking fiscal. So to apply contractionary fiscal policy, they can do really 3 things. They can decrease government spending, they can decrease transfer payments, or increase tax rates. Any of those are going to put the brakes on the economy. If we were showing this on the model, we would show a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Therefore, the second part we have to explain, we would explain by saying, as a result of the contractionary fiscal policy, aggregate demand will shift left, causing a decrease in output, employment, and price level. Remember, there are two parts to a question like this. Identify simply means identify. You don't have to write much else. You don't need a sentence or explanation. But when that word explain comes up, now you've got to explain why. So keep that in mind. It's always a good idea to think of it in terms of, well, this happened because. That's how you answer and explain. And you have to include in some way, shape, or form this causal relationship. Not only did output go down, employment go down, price level go down, why did it go down? What's the cause of that? In this case, it was the leftward shift of aggregate demand that happened because of the contractionary fiscal policy. Finally, C, we want to identify a monetary policy action that would reinforce that fiscal policy action. So here's where we have the simultaneous action. We had fiscal, it was contractionary. Translate the question. What are they asking you? Give me a contractionary monetary policy. So you could say sell bonds, sell securities, raise the discount rate, raise the reserve requirement. Any of these are going to restrict banks' ability to lend, going to cause interest rates to rise. We want to show the effects on the money market graph. So our money market graph, as you can see here, has got nominal interest rates on the y-axis, the quantity of money on the x, a vertical money supply curve, which is fixed by the central bank, and a downward sloping money demand. And this contractionary monetary policy is going to contract money supply, causing money supply to shift left, causing interest rates to go up. And that would reinforce the contractionary fiscal policy from Part B. So that's it for this FRQ and the warm-up of the part of the FRQ. What I want to do now is move into a little bit of review / warm-up that leads into what we're going to talk about with the Phillips curve. So I'm going to go back to ADAS. Of course, ADAS was from Unit 3, but it's really the heart of AP Macro. And it is the model that we're going to use to refer to those big changes in the economy. So we always have to have that in mind. And there are a couple relationships that I want you to have in mind. So there are 4 scenarios that I'm going to walk you through right here just for the sake of review, just to get our minds in a certain place. And you might want to jot down the answers to each of these. The first one, we're going to go through 4 possible shifts. Now, you'll see on all 4 of these, I just happened to put output below full employment. I showed a recessionary gap. That was arbitrary. We could have gone at full employment. We could have gone beyond full employment. It was simply so we had everything up here and able to look at it. What we're really interested in is when there are changes on the ADAS model, what happens to unemployment and price level, and how can we compare the two? How are they relative to one another? So let's talk aggregate demand first. When there are shifts to aggregate demand, what are the resulting changes in unemployment and price level? Well, here, let's talk about a rightward shift. So here we are, we're operating at output level Y, price level P. Assume a rightward shift in aggregate demand. Boom, there it is. What's going to happen to unemployment and price level? Well, as aggregate demand shifts to the right, we can see on the x-axis, Y to Y1, output is increasing. This is a short run scenario. It's a short run change. And if output's going to increase in the short run, we know by the definition of short run, there's no new capital stock, there's no new technology. The only way for that to happen is for firms to hire more workers. So as output increases, as we move along the x-axis, employment's going to increase, unemployment is going to decrease. That's an assumption we can make in this model. At the same time, as we're moving up along the aggregate supply curve, because nothing happened there, ceteris paribus still applies, we move up along the aggregate supply curve, price levels rising, that's inflation. So that's the relationship we're looking at. AD just moved, and we had a decrease in unemployment accompanied by an increase in price level. We had some inflation that existed. We don't know how much inflation necessarily, but we know inflation does exist in this scenario. So keep that in mind. Unemployment went down, price level went up. They're going opposite directions when AD shifts. Let's move AD the other direction and see if that still holds true. Assume a leftward shift in aggregate demand, identify the resulting change in unemployment and price level. So here we are, we're at our original short run equilibrium, P and Y. What's going to happen when we shift aggregate demand to the left? AD shifts to the left, we go from AD to AD1. And as you can see, as we move along that short run aggregate supply curve, the decrease in aggregate demand is going to decrease output. Well, with a decrease in output, firms don't need as many workers. Some people are going to get let go, and you're going to wind up with a higher unemployment rate. So the decrease in output leads to an increase in unemployment. People are out of work. At the same time, we're moving down along the aggregate supply curve. Unemployment's rising, but price level's falling. So once again, this is consistent with what happened the other direction. we have unemployment and price level moving in opposite directions. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that with the Phillips curve. Okay, how about aggregate supply? If aggregate supply is to shift to the right, what's going to happen to unemployment and price level? Well, a rightward shift of aggregate supply is going to increase output. And we just said this, in the short run, if output increases, people are going to get hired, employment goes up, unemployment goes down. But with this, we're going to see price level fall. Why did this happen? We don't know. I mean, it could be because production costs have gone down and that allowed production to go up. Maybe productivity has gone up. Maybe there was a relaxation of some sort of business taxes or regulations. Whatever it was, products are now getting cheaper and we have falling price levels. Now we have unemployment and price level moving in the same direction. That's worth considering. It's, again, something we're going to look at and we're going to see when we analyze the model of the Phillips curve. Going the other direction, we start at price level P, output level Y, assume a leftward shift in the short run aggregate supply curve, identify the resulting change in unemployment and price level. Here's your leftward shift in SRAS. Output's decreasing. We see that on the y-axis with output decreasing. We just said it a moment ago, unemployment's going to go up. People are going to lose their jobs. Firms don't need as many workers because they're not producing as much stuff. At the same time, though, here, as SRAS shifts left, price level's now increasing. This is also known as cost push inflation. We have some cost push inflation going on here. So it's a scenario where people are losing their jobs, output is going down, unemployment's going up, but at the same time, price level's rising. Has this ever happened in real life? Of course it has. And hopefully we know this at this point because it's been a part of our course. This is what was going on in the 1970s. This was 1970s stagflation, where you had this prolonged period of high and rising unemployment accompanied by high and rising price levels, high and rising inflation rates. We're going to see this. This is a major topic when you start learning about the Phillips curve. So once again, keep this scenario in mind. There's a reason we're reviewing these topics before getting into the Phillips curve. Okay, that's the ADAS part of it. There's one more component, one more topic that you already know that I want to use to review before we get into the Phillips curve. The natural rate of unemployment. Now, hopefully that's already in mind. We know what it is. It's instinctive. We know what the natural rate of unemployment is. But let's just remind ourselves of the three types of unemployment, which two are included in the natural rate? Jot down your answer real quick. Remember, there are three types of unemployment. There's cyclical, there's frictional, there's structural. Of those three types of unemployment, when we refer to the natural rate of unemployment, which two exist? Which one is not there? Which one is at zero at the natural rate? One more reminder before I get to the answer. The natural rate of unemployment, what is that again? That's the unemployment rate that you would see in an economy when it's operating at full employment output levels. So at full employment, what kinds of unemployment do we have? We're going to have frictional and structural unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the sum of frictional and structural unemployment. We have zero cyclical unemployment. Remember, cyclical unemployment is that unemployment that comes about because of a recession. Well, if we're at full employment, we're not in the midst of a recession. We're at full employment. That's the happy place. But we do still have frictional and structural unemployment. You're going to have frictional unemployment. Some people are between two jobs or they just graduated from college and they're looking for a new job. We're going to have some structural unemployment. Some people just may not have the skill set that's necessary for jobs that are out there today. So those will exist even when economies are operating at the natural rate, when they're operating at full employment output. All right. So again, this was all a refresher. This is not new content. I'm sure you've done all this already, but it's all stuff that you want to have in mind before jumping into the Phillips curve. So that said, we need to get into the Phillips curve. We need to learn about the Phillips curve. I'm going to talk a little bit about where this thing came from. And I want to remind you before I do that, you don't have to know the history of the Phillips curve. You don't have to know any names or dates to be successful in AP Macro. It's not part of it. But a little context can be helpful to help you understand the concept and apply the concept maybe a little bit better. That's the reason I'll bring up a little bit of this stuff. Not a lot, I don't want to overwhelm you with it, but just a little bit of context. Before going there, let's define a few things. Okay, I keep referring to the Phillips curve model. What is this? What is the Phillips curve model? The Phillips curve model is a model, it's an economic model, which is going to illustrate the relationship between inflation and unemployment, both in the short run and in the long run. So given this definition, very basic definition, let's start constructing the model. So we'll begin constructing the model with the axes. We always start with the axes. So I want you to draw this as you're writing this out, as you're viewing this video. On your y-axis, we're going to put the inflation rate. Inflation, as you recall, is the increase in price level. On the x-axis, we're going to put the unemployment rate, unemployment as a percentage of the labor force, obviously, and we're going to look at the relationship between these two variables in the short run and the long run. In the short run, we are going to assume the Phillips curve is going to illustrate that a trade-off exists. This is only in the short run, keep that in mind. And because we say a trade-off exists, a negative relationship or inverse relationship exists between inflation and unemployment, we're going to show this as a negatively sloped short run Phillips curve. So our SRPC is going to have a negative slope to it, and it's going to indicate for any economy really that there exists a trade-off between these two indicators. If you're going to, watch my cursor here, if you're going to have high rates of unemployment, you're probably going to have that accompanied by low rates of inflation. As unemployment falls, the trade-off that exists, there's a major economic concept there. The trade-off that exists is that as you decrease unemployment, you're going to increase inflation. Now, that's in the short run. That relationship does not hold in the long run. And what we're going to see is that in the long run, the natural rate of unemployment, which is what we see as unemployment in the long run, the natural rate of unemployment is not affected by changes in the inflation rate. And to illustrate that, we have a vertical long run Phillips curve. And that vertical long run Phillips curve is going to intersect the x-axis at the natural rate of unemployment. U sub n here represents the natural rate of unemployment, what we just reviewed. So what again is that? We're saying that the long run Phillips curve exists at the natural rate. That's the unemployment rate that exists when an economy is operating at full employment output. We're going to come back to that shortly when we start talking about equilibrium and how we show equilibrium on this model. So this is the model. I haven't put any kind of equilibrium up here yet because it depends. It truly depends. And we're going to work towards that, and we're going to get to that before the end of this video. But I wanted to see the model first in and of itself. Now, where did it come from? I'm going to take a quick little diversion here into the history of it. Not much at all, but just a little context to see where this came from. The Phillips curve itself, it's not just a creative name. It's named for an economist. It's named for an economist named A.W. Phillips, who did a good bit of research in the United Kingdom comparing wages and employment for well over 100 years. You're talking mid-18th to mid-19th century. And he discovered in his research this negative relationship. That research became or inspired research into inflation and unemployment instead of wages, inflation and unemployment, and became a very reliable, really, I don't want to just say theory, but data set in the 1950s and 60s, really into the 1960s. So what I've put up here is just a very, very simple model, a scatter plot of inflation and unemployment rate figures from the 1960s in the United States. And just a quick scan of this gives you an idea of just how consistent those numbers happen to be in the 1960s. Now, these are average numbers, but if you took a best fit line of that, you'd see a very clear negative relationship, a negatively sloped short run Phillips curve, where over here at relatively higher rates of unemployment, you had low rates of inflation. Moving over here at relatively lower rates of unemployment, you had higher rates of inflation. So the model looked great and it was very reliable. It even informed policymakers. It informed policymakers who said, well, if we want to lower unemployment, we're going to have to deal with higher inflation. If we want to lower inflation, we have to deal with higher unemployment. And it seemed to be a very reliable source in the 1960s. Then the 1970s happened. And we know, I already referenced it, what happened in the 1970s. The 1970s are characterized by that period we call stagflation. And stagflation is defined as high unemployment accompanied by high rates of inflation. Well, that shouldn't be possible according to the Phillips curve. And when you plot the points onto this same model, it kind of disrupts what we thought we knew. So looking at it another way, here's the 1960s, that nice, smooth, negative slope. And I did this is not mathematically calculated, but a very rudimentary best fit line there to indicate some form of regression analysis. A negatively sloped short run Phillips curve for the 1960s, but then this odd constellation out here would be the 1970s. And what we learned, what economists learned from this was not that the Phillips curve was wrong, but that, oh yeah, the Phillips curve can move. It shifts just like every other model that we've dealt with. And what happened in the 1970s was that the schedule changed. As inflationary expectations changed, as structural changes occurred in the economy, the whole schedule changed and you wound up with a Phillips curve somewhere further out. And that allowed for still a negative relationship in the short run, but a negative relationship that consisted of higher rates of inflation and higher rates of unemployment. So the schedule does change. The short run Phillips curve does shift. So let's talk more academically now, back to AP Macro, about why and when and how that happens. So the short run Phillips curve first. We're going to talk about it independently, and then we'll jump over to the long run Phillips curve. As we have here, as you've already drawn, and hopefully you'll draw it again, we've got inflation on our y-axis, we have unemployment on the x-axis, we have a downward sloping short run Phillips curve. Before shifting it, let's talk about moving along the Phillips curve. Short run macro equilibrium can be identified at some point along the short run Phillips curve at any given time. So again, think back to your ADAS model. At any given time on that ADAS model, not only do we have output and price level, but there's a given unemployment rate and inflation rate combination, and that can be identified on the Phillips curve. So here, point A could identify some short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where at that point, you have a specific unemployment rate and a specific inflation rate. That's the symbol pi, the Greek letter pi, which we can use as an abbreviation for inflation. Pro tip here, I would not use the letter I. A lowercase I indicates interest rates, and uppercase I indicates investment spending. You're much safer using pi, which is widely accepted, or just writing the word inflation. All right. So point A can represent some combination of inflation and unemployment. But it's not the only, it's a whole collection. The schedule is a whole collection of equilibrium. So what that also implies is, like any other schedule that we've dealt with, there is movement along the schedule. So what causes movement along the schedule? Think back to our review. Demand shocks are going to move this point. Demand shocks, that be a shift in aggregate demand, is going to cause movement along the short run Phillips curve. For example, again, think back to the examples in our warm-up and our review. If aggregate demand were to shift to the right, what happened to unemployment and inflation as a result? Well, let's think back. AD shifts right, output goes up, unemployment goes down. And unemployment going down in this example was accompanied by higher rates of inflation, and we move along the short run Phillips curve. So the movement from point A to point B, movement along the Phillips curve, is the result of, or even a reflection of, a rightward shift in aggregate demand, a positive demand shock. If aggregate demand were to shift the other direction, a leftward shift in aggregate demand, we're going to see a decrease in output, unemployment goes up, and the movement would actually be from point B to point A, as we see an increase in the level of unemployment and an expected decrease in the inflation rate. So make that connection. We've got to connect models in macroeconomics. And the way we connect these two models, when aggregate demand shifts, we're going to move along the short run Phillips curve. Okay, that takes care of that. Well, what about shifting the whole thing? What causes the entire schedule to change? Well, we have a couple of shifters. The first and probably most widely cited would be shocks to aggregate supply, shifts of aggregate supply. So the one we already discussed, the one I showed you with the data set with the scatter plot, was an adverse supply shock, a leftward shift of aggregate supply, cost push inflation, what we use to illustrate stagflation. That adverse supply shock is going to be reflected here on the Phillips curve as a rightward shift of the short run Phillips curve. It's going to result in higher rates of inflation and higher rates of unemployment at all levels. The entire schedule has changed. So make that connection in your mind. When we see SRAS shift to the left, we're going to see the SRPC shift to the right. A positive supply shock, if the short run aggregate supply curve were to shift to the right, well, then that's going to be accompanied by, that's going to be reflected by a leftward shift of the short run Phillips curve. So again, this is something that's very simple to commit to memory. These are mirror reflections of one another. When aggregate supply shifts one direction, SRPC shifts the other direction. The other shifter goes right alongside this. It has to do with inflationary expectations. For any given, and I want you to remember this, try to write it down if you can. For any given short run Phillips curve, there is a fixed inflationary expectation. When that inflationary expectation changes, we're going to witness a shift of the short run Phillips curve. The entire schedule is going to change. So if inflationary expectations go up, our short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right. They're going to go up with it. If there is a decrease in inflationary expectations, then we're going to see a leftward shift. SRPC is going to shift left with it. Okay, so you have two shifters of the short run Phillips curve. Shifts of the short run aggregate supply curve, changes in the expected inflation rate. Commit that to memory. You've got to know that. That's how we're going to manipulate this thing. The long run Phillips curve, let's take it by itself and talk about it a little bit. It also can shift, but it's going to shift for different reasons. We already know that changes in the rate of inflation cannot affect it, and that's why we have a vertical line here. Therefore, what will? Well, the only thing that's really going to cause a shift, and there are a lot of reasons why this can happen, would be a change in the natural rate of unemployment, because that's what this represents. If the natural rate of unemployment were to increase, and we can talk about why that may happen, then we're going to see a rightward shift in the long run Phillips curve. If it were to decrease, then we're going to see a leftward shift. Why would that happen though? Because that's something that's a little bit tougher to wrap our heads around, to comprehend. I don't want to go too deep into it because there are a lot of different things that could potentially affect the natural rate of unemployment. But I think the best way to approach this is to really consider the nature of this indicator. What is this thing representing? What are we talking about? We're talking about the combination of frictional and structural unemployment. Okay, so you've got to think about workers, potential workers who are unemployed, who are seeking a job, currently seeking a job. Maybe they just got laid off. Maybe they just finished college and they're seeking a job, so they're frictionally unemployed. Or those workers that are structurally unemployed, that don't currently have the skill set to get a job in this economy, in this labor market. Why would that amount change? What would cause that amount to change over time? Had a professor tell me one time, I can't recall which class it even was, that one of the best indicators of that would be the duration of unemployment. Think about workers being unemployed for a longer or shorter amount of time and connect that to both frictional and structural unemployment. If workers are going to extend their job search for one reason or another, or shrink their job search for one reason or another, that's going to affect how many people are frictionally and structurally unemployed at a given time, which will therefore affect the natural rate of unemployment. What could cause that? There could be a lot of things. Changes in the levels of unemployment benefits could be one. Changes in structural conditions in an economy. With structural unemployment, we need to talk about automation, obviously. Are changes happening within certain industries that make certain skill sets obsolete? Of course, that could have an effect on structural unemployment and could have an effect on the duration of unemployment. So really, there's not just one or two concrete things that'll cause a change in natural rate of unemployment. It comes down to, are there more, are there less frictionally and structurally unemployed workers? And if there are, then we're going to see changes in the natural rate. We're going to see a shift in the LRPC. Okay. Let's practice this a little bit. We've gone over most of the scenarios that you're going to see, especially within the context of AP Macro, when it comes to using the short run, long run Phillips curve, the model of the Phillips curve. But there is one more that we need to talk about. The skill that we want to practice within the context of this topic is, how do we demonstrate an understanding of a specific economic situation on an accurately labeled graph of the Phillips curve? That's skill 4.B. Well, before we do that, I want to consider what situations should we be able to demonstrate with a Phillips curve. The first three of these we just did. I'm not going to repeat myself. I want to make sure we understand what these are, but we just talked about these. One is that we should be able to show movement along the short run Phillips curve. That's going to occur, like we just said, because of a shift of aggregate demand. So as aggregate demand were to shift, say aggregate demand shifts to the right, then obviously we're moving along the short run Phillips curve up and to the left, indicating a lower unemployment rate and a higher inflation rate. We need to be able to show a shift of the short run Phillips curve. What causes that? Primarily, it's a reflection of the short run aggregate supply curve. It is also obviously a reflection of a change in inflationary expectations. And as we just said, a shift of the long run Phillips curve, well, that's going to happen because the natural rate of unemployment is going to change. What we haven't discussed yet, and what I want to show you on a whiteboard, is how do we illustrate long run equilibrium, as we have seen on ADAS, and how do we illustrate output gaps, recessionary and inflationary output gaps, on our model of the Phillips curve. So to do that, I'm going to switch over. It's whiteboard time, and we're going to switch over to a whiteboard and work our way through. So what I would encourage you to do is sheet of paper, your own whiteboard, your laptop, whatever you have available, work through these examples with me, draw out these graphs, And let's make sure we can use these things. So here's my whiteboard. I've got up in the corner the scenarios that we want to be able to show as a reminder to myself. And what I have already drawn for you would be long run equilibrium. So as a reminder, long run equilibrium occurs when AD, SRAS, LRAS all intersect at the same point, when our current output level is equal to full employment, when our current unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. All of that must be true. So on the left, on the screen on the left, you see ADAS and how we show long-run equilibrium on ADAS. We've known this since Unit 3. This is not new. How do we show that on the Phillips curve? Well, that's what I have drawn for you already. We have inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x, downward sloping SRPC, vertical LRPC. This equilibrium here, I'll call it point A. That point where SRPC and LRPC intersects, that represents our long-run equilibrium. We know that because what it's saying is this is the combination of unemployment and inflation that we will have in the long run. We're going to be at the natural rate of unemployment. At that natural rate, we're going to be at the expected rate of inflation, which is along that SRPC where it intersects with LRPC. So when you are asked to show long-run equilibrium on the graph of the Phillips curve, you would show what I have labeled here as part A, point A. What about a recessionary gap? I'm going to switch colors here. That's not helpful. And we're going to look at another color. A recessionary gap. A recessionary gap, as you know, is going to exist when our current output level, we'll call it Y1, is less than full employment output. And at that point, we know that the actual rate of unemployment is going to be, let me erase that, greater than the natural rate of unemployment. So if I'm calling this point B, how do I show that over here on our graph of the Phillips curve? Well, I've got to identify a point, a macroeconomic equilibrium, where the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate. That's going to be over here. I want to identify the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, and I'll call them U sub B, pi sub B, to go along with point B, that corresponds with that point on the Phillips curve. And what you're going to see is the recessionary gap, when I show it on the Phillips curve, is actually going to exist to the right of the long-run Phillips curve. Now, if you stop and think through it a little bit, that makes perfectly good sense. When there's a recessionary gap, the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate, and that's what this is indicating. But I can understand why a lot of students struggle with this. It's not as intuitive because we've learned for so long over on ADAS, over on the left, that recessionary gaps are over to the left because output is less than full employment. You've got to make a connection there and understand these are mirror reflections of one another. If you have to, connect it back to employment. If we're on ADAS, employment has a positive relationship with real GDP. But over here on the x-axis of the Phillips curve, we have unemployment, not employment. So that's what causes that mirror reflection of these two models. So a recessionary gap on our Phillips curve is going to be to the right of the long-run Phillips curve. What about our inflationary gap? Well, on ADAS, as you well know, an inflationary gap is going to exist when output is beyond full employment. So we're going to be out here. There's my inflationary gap. And as a result of that, because now we're beyond full employment, the unemployment rate is actually less than the natural rate. I'm going to call that point C. And when we bring that over here and find an unemployment rate less than the natural rate, we're going to wind up over here to the left of the long-run Phillips curve. Your inflationary gap is represented at point C as that gap between this lesser unemployment rate, that unemployment rate less than a natural rate. Again, it looks different. I know it looks different, but you've got to stop and give it a few minutes worth of thought and make sure it makes sense as to why it looks different. It's really based upon the relationship between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. Make that connection, because that's going to come up. It's going to come up a good bit in AP Macroeconomics, and you've got to be able to accurately show that on your model. Okay, debrief and summary time. That covered everything that we had planned today. We have defined the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is this model which illustrates for us and explains for us the relationship between inflation and unemployment, both in the long run and the short run. We have gone through the shifters of both the long run and short run Phillips curve. We've talked about moving along the Phillips curve. We've learned about skill B. We should feel confident about skill B and how to utilize that to demonstrate that we know what we're talking about, that we can actually illustrate this economic situation on an accurately labeled graph of the Phillips curve. And we've made connections between the short run, long run Phillips curve and the ADAS model. And that was that last little piece there. Never forget to make those connections. ADAS is our picture of the economy, but we can show the same scenarios in different ways. And this is one different way we can do that. Your homework. We're going to go back to an AP exam practice, but we're going to do a much more recent question this time. We're going to look at question 1 from 2017, just parts A and B. So if you're watching this live, take a screenshot of this question, take a picture of it with your phone if you need to. Obviously, if you're not watching it live, if it's recorded, then you can pause and go through this question as you will. Be careful now. You're given data up here. Make sure you plot those points in the right spots, and keep in mind what you're really looking at on your X and Y axis with the Phillips curve. But this is a good example of how the AP macro exam can ask you questions about the Phillips curve, how it can be applied. So take your time with that. We will go over the answer to this first thing tomorrow when we're going over topic 5.3. That's everything I've got for you today. One thing I did want to add for you, College Board asked us to remind you that you have this ability to communicate with College Board. We're aware that not everyone has reliable access to the internet. Not everyone has a device that they can use. So College Board wants to make sure that there are solutions to help those students who need some help, who need something to be able to show what they've learned, to show their best work. So if you are in need of mobile tools, you need connectivity, or if you just know someone who does, contact College Board. You can go to cb.org/tech, and they'll be able to help you there. So please know that College Board wants to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to show what they have learned and to get credit for the work they have done in all of their AP classes, including, of course, AP Macro. That about does it for today. I really appreciate you being here. I hope that you got something out of this. I'm going to sign off, and Ms. Ray Fields will be back with you tomorrow to talk about topic 5.3, money growth and inflation. You're going to learn about something called the equation of exchange. It's good stuff. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.